Hey there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first video for Chapter 13, How Populations Evolve. Now, the moment we say the word evolution, obviously there's someone we need to discuss. Yet another hero of biology, Charles Darwin, the author of the theory of evolution, was a naturalist on the British ship the HMS Beagle in the 1830s. I believe their voyage lasted from 1831 to 1836, and amongst many other destinations they reached the Galapagos. Now, a ship's naturalist, it was Darwin's purpose on board, whenever possible, as part of the expedition, to get out and document species that the British had never seen before, to take illustrations, collect samples whenever possible, to write down what they looked like in great detail. And while he was doing this, because he was already paying so much attention to the differences between the types of plants and animals that he was seeing that people from his country had never seen before, he noticed certain differences and similarities between animals, especially some birds, down in the Galapagos archipelago, some finches, and he is famous for his observations of these finches. He noticed that specific birds on particular islands were well adapted to their habitat. That is, they had particular characteristics, either behavioral, physical, or both, that made them very well suited to where they were living, particularly in ways that helped them get food. And eventually, he published his thoughts not only on these differences, but on his theory of how these differences came to be and on how new changes and new variety comes to exist in life in a little book, actually a very, very short paper called On the Origin of Species. You might have heard of it. Maybe. You know, biologists, we like to talk about it every once in a while. There is something here, though, that I would like to discuss. When we say that this is the theory of evolution, it is a very common misconception to think that because we say theory, this means that maybe we're not sure about whether or not evolution works, or perhaps this is just a guess, little better than a hypothesis, an educated guess. This is one place where the public and scientists use the same word to mean something slightly different. In the scientific community, a theory is a very widely held, strongly supported explanation. It cannot be a theory without lots of evidence and data that support it. If you start accumulating a lot of data that doesn't support it, it doesn't hold up as a theory. We don't call it a law. You'll have laws in physics and mathematics, but in chemistry and biology, we tend to not call things laws. We call them theories instead, because we find that it is necessary to continue accruing new evidence and data to keep seeing if it's supported. We keep testing it over and over again. If we didn't keep testing it, we wouldn't have the whole field of evolutionary biology. But we don't think it's enough to just let it sit there. We need to keep picking at it and make sure that we make it as complete as possible. So we never call it a law. We stay with the word theory, even though it has the same weight because it has so much evidence in support of it. Evolution, in a nutshell, is the change of species over time. But what it means is that new species are descended from older species that were different. How that change comes about can happen in a number of ways. We can track this change through time because of the presence of fossils, the remains, either the direct remains of animals and plants that were once alive, or evidence of their existence. Some remains are like this set of fossils right here, the actual fossilized skeleton. Others are evidence, like the eggshells left behind from a dinosaur nest, or the fossilized footprints from a saber-toothed tiger. They aren't part of that animal themselves, but they are preserved symbols, preserved evidence that those animals were there. We find these fossils embedded in the strata in the earth. Strata are layers of rock and these fossils have been compressed between the layers, sort of like drying a flower in between the pages of a book, keeping it safe, sealed, and flattened in between layers of rock like you see down here along this beach. Paleontologists, who are biologists that study fossils, are able to dig down through these strata and very, very carefully find and uncover these fossils so that we can study how evolution has changed lineages, families of species over time. Overall, this collection of fossils found from the strata and how old they are and how things change over time is called the fossil record. It's the chronicles that we get from fossils that tell us how things have changed over time amongst a particular group of related species. Sometimes we find a transitional form. Transitional forms are very strong support for the theory of evolution, and they are species that exhibit a part-way stage between one distinctly recognized group of animals or plants and another. A classic example is this famous skeleton of Archaeopteryx, which displays both reptilian, or lizard-like, and avian, or bird-like characteristics. See, for instance, this long, bony tail. And this is a head that does not have a beak. It has a mouth with teeth. These are both characteristics of being like a reptile. But see how long these extended bones are out in the wings? And the remnants of these feathers? These are distinctly bird-like. Archaeopteryx was neither completely a reptile nor a bird. It was in between. This is what makes it a transitional form. When we look at transitional forms and the species that they end up giving rise to, we see sometimes there is a preservation of homology. Homology is a technical term for the similarities we see between groups of species in evolution because they share specific ancestry. They are related to each other, like part of the same family over time. Like seeing the same nose show up in a family over and over and over again, even generations down the line. When we look at specific parts of that structure that look similar, those are homologous structures. So say, across many species, even though they are very different, when we find structures that are very similar, like the same bones showing up in slightly different shapes and proportions in the hands of humans, and the paws of dogs and cats, and the fins of dolphins, these are all homologous structures. They're used for the same thing, they're still in the same part of the body, they've just slowly changed over time, but they are still there, because these groups of animals are all related. Now, once upon a time, before we were able to take bone samples and collect DNA and actually study what percentage of DNA is similar between groups of individuals, the presence of these homologous structures was our best way to try and figure out which species are related to which. Now, however, through molecular biology, we are able to look at the DNA of related species and figure out just who is related to whom and how closely, based on how much DNA they share in common. Sometimes, when we're still looking at the body instead of the DNA, we notice that things have changed and structures have changed in certain species, and they have begun to go away. They've gotten smaller and they are not being used anymore. Sometimes they're still present in the body, but they're so small that they've really become insignificant inside the modern day species. These are called vestigial structures. A classic example of this is the pelvis and hind leg in whales. Now, I know you're thinking, wait a minute, whales don't have a hind leg. They've got fins in front and a big old tail in the back. We know how these guys are built. And you are absolutely correct. But if you look at the ancient ancestor of the whale before it went back to the ocean, you see a whale-like head, not long tail, those are already present, and here, sure enough, there's a functional walking hind leg. as they went back to the water, as they suddenly became more streamlined for living in the water, the legs got shorter, and they became more squat. They became more built like crocodiles or dolphins. And the legs got shorter and shorter until they were mostly in the water, until finally the pelvis and the hind legs became very, very small. And now they are so small, there's still an ancestral pelvis, just a teeny tiny little bit of bone inside the body of the modern whale. This is the skeleton of a modern day baleen whale, a bow-headed whale. This is so small that it's completely inside the body of the whale. There are even some snakes that still have a teeny tiny little structure like this inside their body where their pelvis would be. It's all that's left. These are vestigial structures. By studying, at one point, the homology, and now the molecular biology of related species, we're able to put together evolutionary trees that show us visually which species are related to which, roughly which ones branched off first and which species are oldest, and we can track what changes occurred in evolution over time. These diagrams are called evolutionary trees, but don't be confused. You'll sometimes see them called cladograms or phylogenetic trees. I know it's confusing. It's 3 different names, but it all refers to the exact same thing. For instance, here we can see that generally looking at degrees of change going from left to right, left being the oldest, right being the newest, over time, older time being at the bottom, more recent time being at the top, and this is all just relative. There are no specific millions of years being measured here. We can see that sharks are the eldest, followed by raven fish, amphibians, and so on. And along the trunk of the tree, we can see between where species branch off, these are the major changes that happened evolutionarily, like developing a backbone, vertebrae, and developing a bony skeleton, and eventually, just for mammals, for primates and rodents and rabbits, developing hair and fur. All right, these are the major changes that occurred before each new group of animals branched off from the main family evolutionary tree. However, it takes evolution a long time to occur, and it can be very difficult to try and understand evolution from the inside, because the longer lived the species you're looking at, the longer evolution takes. The process that this occurs in is called natural selection. Natural selection happens when there's some sort of pressure applied to a species that makes it difficult to survive. So only those individuals in a population of a species that have some special edge and are able to deal with the problem are able to survive and reproduce. Say, for instance, if there's a really good predator, they're very good at what they do, in an area, only those prey species, or only the specific individuals of the prey species that can outsmart them or hide from them or move to a new area, those are the ones that survive. And so long as those traits that let them survive are genetic and they can be passed down to their offspring, those offspring will continue to have the same traits. So long as those traits continue to be useful, ideally those individuals will be just fine and they will be able to survive. Now, normally this takes a very long time, but this doesn't mean that there aren't tools that let us see some change over time in a shorter amount of time. A classic example of this is artificial selection. Yes, we have natural selection. This is when it happens by itself in nature. Artificial selection is when humans apply a pressure that make a species change. And we've done this all over the place. If you've ever owned a cat or dog, you have experienced artificial selection, especially in dogs. Ancient humans and their ancestors bred wolves that came and shared their company, and we bred them for characteristics that we wanted. We bred them to be friendly to humans. We bred them to protect our livestock and our children. Sometimes we bred them to be powerful runners and protective of us, hard workers. Sometimes we bred them to be fast and have sharp eyes for hunting. Sometimes we bred them to have an incredible sense of smell. Sometimes we just bred for size. Sometimes we breed something a little odd, like the Chinese Crested, a mostly hairless dog. Sometimes we breed something and nobody understands why. These are teacup Chihuahuas. First we bred the Chihuahua. Then we miniaturized the Chihuahua. Yeah, I still don't understand that one. But all of these breeds are the same species. These are all members of Canis domesticus, and they're all ultimately, if you go all the way back, descended from wolf stock. This is artificial selection. Other examples you can find in domestic chickens with their incredibly ornate, ridiculous plumage. And all the different breeds of horses. Some for riding, some for showing, some for doing very hard work. Another example of artificial selection that we can actually use in science to help benefit society, and that we can use as a lesson, is the way in which we breed, by accident, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. By exposing them too often to antibiotics, we end up breeding resistance into those that survive. They survive because the antibiotic doesn't get them, and when they breed, if that resistance is genetic, just like in natural selection, they pass that sucker down, which makes it significantly less fun for patients and doctors the world over. But that is the topic for another discussion. This is going to wrap up the first video of Chapter 13, and I will see you next time, ladies and gentlemen. Bye.